And now, marine weather around Alaska.
For tonight, we have this front weakening and stretching out to the east here, bringing rain and gusty winds from the eastern Aleutians into the Alaska Peninsula there. And Pribilof Island's right on the northern edge of the precipitation shield with rain down in toward, well, actually just east of Atka and then in toward Nikolsky. This area lifting northward, so pretty good evening and overnight period for the western Aleutians. Clear and cold over the interior. Chance of a few skiffs of snow and a weak disturbance there along the western Arctic coast, Point Hope, Cape Lisburne, and some flurries or snow showers here for the southeast interior, eastern Alaska range, and then kind of hit and miss, mostly miss over the Copper River Basin. And rain northern panhandle, snow in the northern panhandle on down toward Petersburg, and then actually into Hyder with rain along Prince of Wales Island coast up to maybe Sitka. And for tomorrow, about that same pattern there for the southeast coast. Drier conditions with some clearing now, pushing into the Copper River Basin. High pressure, cold temperatures over much of interior Alaska, out into the northern Bering Sea, with fair conditions down to Kodiak Island. This front here kind of weakening, really washing out over the Alaska Peninsula as this low tracks off to the east from the system there. And that is what's going to bring the heavy wind or at least the heavy precipitation into the panhandle. Lighter amounts to the north, heavier to the south. Petersburg could see 4 to 8 inches, and again, Hyder 8 to 11 inches. Strong high pressure over the eastern border there keeps it clear and cold over interior Alaska, right on down to the North Gulf Coast. Kodiak, light winds, mostly sunny skies, mild temperatures there, and dry over the northern and central Bering Sea. And this system coming northward from off, just barely getting on the map tomorrow, but it lifts northward here with a weak low developing right up. Actually, let me go the right direction. There, the front pushes up, and that'll bring a little bit of an increase in the wind and precipitation from Adak eastward into the Alaska Peninsula. Coastal water forecast here for the south coast of the Panhandle for tomorrow. West winds 15 knots and variable winds at 15 knots on the central coast. And then northeast 20 to 25 knots on the north coast. Lynn Canal, northeast winds 20 knots, southeast at 20 for Stevens Passage, south winds 15 knots for Clarence Strait. And for the day on Thursday, Clarence Strait, south winds 25 knots, north at 25 for Stevens Passage, north at 30 knots for Lynn Canal. And on the south coast, west-northwest winds at 20 knots, central coast, northeast 25 knots. And the north coast, north to northeast, 25 to 30. Prince William Sound, northeast at 15 knots. Eastern North Gulf Coast, northeast 15 to 25 with higher gusts, north 15 for the western Gulf Coast. And Kamishak Bay, Barren Islands, north winds 25 knots. Cook Inlet, northeast at 10 to 20. And for the day on Thursday, pick the winds up a little bit in Cook Inlet with small craft advisories out of the northeast at 25 knots south of the Forelands, northeast 30 knots, Kamishak Bay, 25 knots for the Barren Islands, north winds 20 knots for the western North Gulf Coast, and variable 10 to 20 knots for the east side. Prince William Sound, northeast winds 15 knots. Kodiak Island tomorrow, northeast 20 to, or north to northeast at 20 knots. And the Alaska Peninsula, small craft advisories, east-northeast winds 25 to 30 knots, 25 knots out of the northeast for Bristol Bay. And then increase in the winds on Thursday here with gale warnings for the Alaska Peninsula, east 30 to 40 knots, and northeast 30 knots now for Bristol Bay and Kodiak Island, north to northeast 20 to 25 knots. Eastern Aleutians tomorrow, south to southeast winds 25 knots, northwest winds at 20 knots for Adak and Atka, north winds 30 knots for Amchitka Island, and then swinging around to the south-southeast, but only 15 knots from Kiska to Shemya. And then for those areas on Thursday, north to northeast at 15 to 20, Amchitka Island, north to northeast at 25 to 30 knots. Gale warnings out for Adak and Atka. Northeast winds 35 knots, seas 17 feet. And good gales out for the eastern Aleutians here. East to northeast at 40 to 45 knots. And for the southwest coast tomorrow, northeast winds 25 knots, northeast 20 for St. Lawrence Island. Norton Sound, northeast winds at 10 knots. Gale warnings for the Pribilof Islands and St. Matthew Island, east winds 35 knots. Still holding on to the gales for St. Paul and St. George on Thursday at 35 knots from the east, east 25 St. Matthew Island, and here for the southwest coast, east and northeast at 25 knots, east at 20 for St. Lawrence Island, and 15 knots there in Norton Sound. Real light winds here for the central and eastern Beaufort Sea coast tomorrow, about 5 knots, and that's about it. Southeast at 10 for the western Arctic coast, and the Chukchi Sea anywhere from variable to south at 10 to 25 knots. Then it gets a little more organized on Thursday. South to southeast winds here 25 to 35 knots for the Chukchi Sea. South winds 30 knots, so good brisk wind advisories for the western Arctic coast. South at about 20 on the central coast. And we've got southeast winds 15 knots there for the east side.